It is date's October 23rd, 2009, 2 o'clock. Sergeant David Rice, Missouri State Highway Patrol, and it is
Michael Kuti
with the Cole County Juvenile Office. And we're here in Cole County at the site where you say this occurred, where you can you walk me through, I want you to walk me through step by step, when you got up here, what actually occurred?
We walked. Here, where everything just happened. I'm gonna drag her into the hole area.
Okay. What happened here?
I strangled her.
Okay.
And then cut her throat and stabbed her.
Okay. When you strangled her, was she facing you?
Yeah.
Okay. So she was facing you, looking towards you.
Mm-hmm.
You strangled her. One hand?
Two
hands? Okay. And what happened? Did she stand up, fall to the ground? What happened?
She'd fallen to the ground.
Okay. Was she moving at that point?
No.
Okay. So she was lying on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Was she face down on her
No.
back?
She was on her back.
Okay. And where was, you said earlier you had a knife. Where was your knife at that point?
I put it back in my pocket. Well, like, not pocket, but like, it held it.
It's not always when you kill someone and then write exactly in your diary how did you kill them, but Alyssa Bustamante did exactly that. This is the writing in her diary that she tried to erase by hiding it through another ballpoint pen. But when the investigator cleans that above ink to clear the beneath text, this chilling text was written beneath. I just killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throats and stabbed them. It was amazing. It's pretty enjoyable. I gotta go to church now. LOL. And the person she killed was the unfortunate 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten. Turning of an ordinary day into a nightmare. On that fateful day, Patty Price was at home with her 3 kids, Anthony, Stephanie, and the youngest, Elizabeth Olten, who was just 9 years old. It was one of those evenings where everything felt normal, and the house was filled with the everyday hustle and bustle. Elizabeth was full of energy, rehearsing for a school play. She was practicing her lines, singing her little songs, and driving her brother a bit crazy in the process, like younger siblings do. Meanwhile, Patty was in the kitchen, preparing to cook dinner, keeping one eye on the clock as she went about her tasks. Then there was a knock on the door. It was the little girl from next door, just 6 years old, who lived across the woods. She had come over to ask if Elizabeth could come out and play for a while. Patty, at first, was hesitant. Dinner was about to be made, and she figured it wasn't the best time for Elizabeth to run off. But the 2 girls were excited, practically bouncing up and down with anticipation. Their eager faces softened Patty's resolve. She gave in, saying, "All right, you can go, but just for an hour. Be back by 6. Now, this was October 21st, 2009, and the sun was going to set at 6:30 p.m. Patty knew Elizabeth was not one to push limits when it came to being out after dark. Elizabeth had always been scared of the dark, and the woods that separated the 2 homes could turn into a pretty spooky place once the sun went down. So, Patty wasn't too worried. She trusted that Elizabeth would be back on time. The evening carried on as planned, and the house started to settle into the routine. But then, 6 o'clock came and went, and Elizabeth didn't come home. Patty's initial calm turned into concern. She picked up the phone and called her neighbor's house, expecting to hear that the girls had lost track of time and were just about to head back. But when the neighbor picked up, they said Elizabeth wasn't there. That response sent a jolt through Patty. This wasn't like Elizabeth. She never stayed out late, especially not with the darkness creeping in. The minutes started to stretch, and Patty's worry deepened. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out what could have gone wrong. She called again, hoping maybe there was a mix-up, but the answer was the same. Elizabeth wasn't there. Patty could feel the fear tightening around her chest. She glanced out the window towards the woods that separated her house from her neighbors, and the shadows seemed to be growing longer, darker, and more threatening. So after that unsettling moment when Patty realized something was terribly wrong, she couldn't shake the feeling that Elizabeth hadn't just wandered off. Her instincts told her that something was off, especially after the neighbor's grandmother insisted that Elizabeth had never been there. Patty knew better. She knew her little girl had left with that neighbor, so she made the only call she could think of. She called the police. The Cole County Sheriff's Department didn't waste any time. Within just 15 minutes, deputies were on the scene, ready to help. Patty joined them as they headed straight to the neighbor's house, the last place Elizabeth was supposed to have been. But when they got there, everyone insisted that Elizabeth wasn't around. The tension grew as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Patty's worry turned into a gut-wrenching fear as it became clear that Elizabeth wasn't where she was supposed to be. With no sign of Elizabeth at the neighbor's house, the search efforts quickly escalated. They weren't going to leave any stone unturned. The fire department joined in, along with local officers, and by the time night had fallen, hundreds of people had come together to search for the little girl. Everyone from concerned neighbors to law enforcement formed search teams, creating a grid around Patty's and her neighbors' homes, determined to find any trace of Elizabeth. But as Wednesday night slipped away, so did the hope of finding her quickly. Elizabeth was still missing, and no one had seen or heard from her. Patty knew her daughter wouldn't just run off. Elizabeth had her cell phone with her, and Patty had been calling it non-stop since she realized her daughter was missing. But every call went straight to voicemail, which only made Patty more anxious. That phone was her only connection to Elizabeth, and it wasn't giving her any answers. The investigators knew they needed to use every tool they had. They contacted the cell phone company and requested an emergency ping on Elizabeth's phone. This ping would send signals to the nearest cell tower, helping them zero in on the phone's location. Soon, the deputies started receiving those pings, and all of them pointed to the same general area, the woods behind the houses. It was a dense, thick forest, stretching over a large area, and searching was going to be a massive task. They knew they couldn't do it alone. By the next day, more investigative units were called in to assist with the search. Everyone believed Elizabeth was still in the area, but finding her in those deep woods was like looking for a needle in a haystack. A missing persons report went out to neighboring law enforcement agencies, and the FBI was brought in to lend their expertise. The woods that had always been there, just a part of the backdrop of their lives, had now become a dark and foreboding place. Patty couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong, but she also couldn't give up hope. The community was rallying together, determined to bring Elizabeth home, but with each passing moment, the unknown became harder to bear. The police were doing everything they could to find her. They searched the woods surrounding the area, combing through every inch of that dense forest. They set up checkpoints on all the roads leading in and out, stopping every car that passed by. They even tracked down all the local registered sex offenders, making sure no stone was left unturned. The skies were filled with planes and helicopters, scouring the ground from above. Dog teams were brought in to sniff out any trace of Elizabeth, and dive teams searched the ponds and rivers, hoping to find some clue. But as Thursday afternoon came around, almost 24 hours had passed since anyone had seen Elizabeth. The police turned their attention back to the last person who had seen her, the 6-year-old neighbor girl who had knocked on Patty's door to ask if Elizabeth could come out to play. Her name was Emma, and she lived just a few houses down from Elizabeth. Emma was questioned by the FBI. She told them a simple story. She had been playing with Elizabeth, and after about an hour, Elizabeth said she was heading home. That was the last time Emma saw her. But something about this didn't sit right. The search teams were still out there, scouring the area, and Elizabeth was still missing. As the investigation dug deeper, more details started to surface. Emma had been playing outside with Elizabeth, and at some point, she got stuck in some thorn bushes. She started crying and screaming for help, calling out her sister, "Alyssa, come help me." Alyssa Bustamante, Emma's 15-year-old half-sister, was the one she called for. Alyssa, along with Emma and her two 11-year-old twin half-brothers, lived with their grandmother and legal guardian, Karen Brooke.
I went up in my room, and then I heard Emma, yelling.
And so you go down to help Emma, and she was stuck. How was she stuck?
Well, there was a big old bush of thorn, big old thorn bushes, and she couldn't get over it. She somehow managed to get herself stuck in there, so I had to go down and help her.
The Bustamante and Olten kids often played together, running back and forth between their homes. Now, during the time when Elizabeth went missing, all the neighborhood kids were accounted for, except for Alyssa. Alyssa admitted to skipping school that day. She knew the law enforcement teams were looking for Elizabeth, but she claimed she didn't know anything about it. The police spoke with her, and at first, nothing seemed off. Alyssa was calm and cooperative, answering their questions without hesitation. She didn't think of her as a suspect. She was just another kid who might have seen something. Alyssa's calm demeanor didn't raise any red flags at the time, but in the background, the investigation was starting to take a different turn. In the meantime, during the search, some of the local volunteers came across something that made them stop in their tracks. It was a spot in the woods that looked eerily like a grave. The volunteers couldn't ignore it, and they knew this was something the investigators needed to see. The investigative unit was called in to process the scene, fearing that the grave might be where Elizabeth was buried. The gravity of the situation hit everyone hard, and the team got to work, led by Sergeant Rice and his forensics crew. They spent hours at the scene, carefully examining every inch of that potential burial site. While this was happening, the FBI continued interviewing Alyssa Bustamante, who was just 15 years old. They decided to bring her to the scene, hoping she might shed some light on what was going on. As the investigation pressed on, something strange caught Sergeant Rice's attention. He overheard Alyssa say something that didn't sit right with him. She mentioned that she had dug that hole herself.
And behind our daycare house, there's two still there that you haven't filled in, right? 2 holes. That from when me and my brothers were digging holes when we lived in the house.
Okay.
And they're really big. But the one that usually I don't really dig very big holes because I get bored. I'll start doing it.
This set off alarm bells in the sergeant's mind, and he couldn't help but ask her why she did it. Alyssa's response was chilling in its simplicity. She said she just liked digging holes and would sometimes bury dead animals in them. But when they looked inside that shallow grave, there was nothing there. Still, the discovery made the situation even more dire. Time was ticking, and they were nearing the 48-hour mark since Elizabeth had disappeared. Sergeant Rice couldn't shake the feeling that the empty hole was significant. It was the perfect size for a small child, just like Elizabeth, and the thought gnawed at him. Back at the Bustamante home, the investigation took another dark turn. The FBI had obtained permission to search the house, and one of their evidence officers was assigned to check Alyssa's room. When the officer opened the door, what they found was nothing short of terrifying. The room was filled with disturbing details that painted a grim picture of Alyssa's state of mind. The walls were covered with strange writings, some scribbled in pen, while others appeared to be written in blood. In one corner, the officer found a poem about cutting, a haunting reference to self-harm, which usually involves using a knife or razor blade. It wasn't just the words that were unsettling. There was also a crude drawing on the wall, a sketch of a person with slash marks across the head and arm. What made it even more disturbing was the name scrawled near the drawing: Emma, Alyssa's younger sister. As they continued to search the room, more pieces of Alyssa's troubled life came to light. The walls were also decorated with cards and letters from someone named Alyssa Bustamante. The return address was from a prison. Alyssa's best friend, Jennifer Meyer, wasn't entirely surprised by what the officers found. She had known about Alyssa's struggles for a while. Jennifer had even talked to another friend, someone who used to be close to Alyssa, about the scars on Alyssa's wrists. Alyssa talked about suicide often, and she had even attempted it a few times. Jennifer knew Alyssa had been carrying a lot of pain, but the full extent of it was something she hadn't realized until now. The evidence in Alyssa's room pointed to something deeply disturbing. The investigation was about to take a dark turn, and the more they uncovered, the more they began to see just how troubled Alyssa was. Now, in that room search, the FBI agent searching Alyssa's room came across something else that sent chills down her spine: a diary, a journal hidden among Alyssa's things. When the investigator opened it and began reading, the words on the page were more than just troubling. They were downright disturbing. The entries talked about dark thoughts, like burning down a house and killing the people inside. And then, as the agent turned to the last entry, she noticed the date. It was Wednesday, October 21st, the same day Elizabeth had disappeared. But something was odd about this final entry. It had been heavily marked over with blue ink, almost as if someone was trying to erase the words written there. Still, one part of the entry peeked through the scribbles. "Now I've got to go to church, LOL." The agent knew this could be critical evidence and immediately collected the diary. The next morning, which was now Friday, marking 2 days since Elizabeth had gone missing, Alyssa was brought to the FBI headquarters for an interview with Sergeant David Rice. Just before the interview started, Rice was handed Alyssa's diary. He took a moment to focus on that last entry, the one that had been scratched out. Using backlighting, they managed to make out 2 chilling words: slit and throat. With this disturbing new information in hand, Sergeant Rice, along with Alyssa's grandmother and a juvenile officer, led Alyssa into the interrogation room. Rice knew that silence could be powerful during an interrogation. People often feel uncomfortable when there's nothing but silence, and it can push them to reveal more than they intend.
The only thing I can think of is just embarrassing things that they find it at me. So.
The pauses during the interview stretched on, sometimes lasting up to 45 seconds or even a minute. And as those silent moments dragged out, the pressure started to get to Alyssa. Her eyes began to tremble, and her head started to shake. The tension was building, and Rice could see it taking its toll on her.
When we go and get the body here, there'll be an autopsy. And it doesn't matter, I work a lot of homicides. It doesn't matter whether the body's burned or not. They'll go through and do an autopsy.
Okay.
And they will discover every injury on her body and the cause of death. And I understand you say she fell, and that's why she died. However, they will know from the autopsy if she was shot, if she was hit in the head, if her throat was cut. They will know all of that from the autopsy. So we need to know the truth, because at the end of the autopsy, they will know exactly how she died.
Just when he sensed that Alyssa was about to break, Rice decided to confront her with the diary. He looked at her and said, "We have your diary, and we've read your diary. Even the last entry, the one you tried to scribble out." And then he waited. The effect of his words was immediate. Alyssa's demeanor changed in an instant.
I need to know what the truth is.
Okay.
We have your diary. We've read your diary, including the last entry.
The calm front she had been trying to maintain began to crack. She knew right then and there that the police were onto her. They knew something she couldn't hide anymore.
We have to know how this happened. And the most important thing is, we have to know where she's at. We have to give this family some closure. Just like if this was your little sister, you would want closure.
At that moment, Alyssa finally started to talk. She began to reveal what had really happened to Elizabeth, but her explanation was far from the truth. She claimed it was all an accident. According to Alyssa, they had been walking in the woods together when Alyssa fell, hit her head, and suddenly died. But Rice wasn't buying it. He calmly explained to Alyssa that they were going to recover Elizabeth's body, and when they did, the autopsy would show every injury, every detail of what had truly happened.
We're just mentioning around. She fell. She died. I didn't know what to do. So I burned her body. Because I didn't really.
She began to recount the chilling events of that fateful day. Alyssa admitted that she had sent her younger sister Emma over to the Olten house to bring Elizabeth back. Once Emma had done what she was told, Alyssa sent her back home. Then, taking Elizabeth by the hand, she led the little girl into the woods.
Let's start at the beginning. Is this something that was planned out, or was this just an accident?
It was an accident.
Okay. Well, this is a starting point then. That's kind of what I thought.
It was a quarter-mile trek, about a 15-minute walk deep into the forest. There was plenty of time for Alyssa to reconsider what she was about to do, to change her mind and to turn back. But she didn't.
I live in the forest. Like I said. And Elizabeth was in there.
Do you have an extra one for her? Yes. Elizabeth was there in the forest?
Yes.
Was she alone?
Yeah.
Okay.
We decided to go hang out. Because it was a nice day. We were just messing.
Take your time.
She kept walking, holding on to Elizabeth's hand, telling her, "I've got something really neat to show you. It's just a little bit further up here." Little did Elizabeth know that Alyssa wasn't leading her to something fun or exciting. She was leading her to a grave she had already dug.
How did she die? 9-year-old girls don't just die.
We were messing around. Then she fell back and hit her head.
Was her throat cut?
Yeah.
Alyssa confessed that when they reached the site, she turned to Elizabeth and began strangling her. She strangled herself multiple times, then pulled out a kitchen knife she had brought along.
What did you use to cut her throat with?
Not.
A pocket knife? A kitchen knife?
Kitchen knife.
Okay. Where's that kitchen knife now?
Alyssa stabbed Elizabeth in the chest 6 or 7 times before finally slitting her throat. The horrific details of her confession stunned everyone involved in the investigation.
I think you dug the hole ahead of time because you knew you were going to kill Elizabeth. I think you tried to dig the hole, like I said, and realized it was too hard to dig down that far. And I think you got Elizabeth out there and knew you were going to kill her. And then you cut her throat. Is that what happened?
After confessing, Alyssa agreed to take Sergeant Rice to where Elizabeth's body was buried. Rice, along with Crime Watch Daily, followed Alyssa into the woods, retracing the steps she had taken just days before. She knew exactly where to go, leading them directly to the spot. The grave was shallow, not well covered at all. As they got closer, it became clear that Elizabeth's body was only buried a few inches beneath the earth. Mud-covered body parts were already visible. It was a horrifying scene, a clear indication of the brutal nature of the crime.
Even if you write something down,
Yeah?
it doesn't matter. Let's say you write it down in pencil, and then you take a pen and try real hard to scratch it out. That doesn't make it go away.
The results of Elizabeth's autopsy later confirmed everything Alyssa had described in her diary. Investigators used a blue light to reveal the final entry in Alyssa's journal from the day Elizabeth disappeared. The words were shocking. "I just killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. It was amazing. It's pretty enjoyable. I gotta go to church now. LOL." The entry showed that Alyssa's actions were not just a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was a cold, calculated murder. Alyssa had planned this for days, even digging the grave 5 days before the murder took place. She had sent her sister to get Elizabeth with the sole purpose of luring her to her death. This level of premeditation met all the legal criteria for first-degree murder. But there was still the question of Alyssa's age. She was only 15 years old. Despite her age, Alyssa was certified to stand trial as an adult. The Cole County Grand Jury reviewed the evidence in the case and returned an indictment on 2 counts: murder in the first degree and armed criminal action. The gravity of her actions couldn't be ignored, and neither could the signs that something had been wrong all along. So after that, 2 years and 4 months after the tragic events that shook the small town of St. Martin's, Missouri, the wheels of justice began to turn. A trial date was finally set for Alyssa Bustamante, the teenager responsible for taking young Elizabeth's life. But just as the prosecution was gearing up for what seemed like an open and shut case, they hit an unexpected roadblock. The defense filed a motion to suppress Alyssa's confession.
Certainly was not in the same, should be held in the same position as the punishment as an adulthood, even though she'd been certified as an adult.
The lawyers argued that because she was a juvenile, some of the questions asked during her interrogation violated Missouri law. The judge agreed, and Alyssa's confession was thrown out of court. Losing that confession was a massive blow to the prosecution. Without it, their clear-cut case of first-degree murder became much harder to prove. And if that wasn't enough, another challenge was looming on the horizon. The U.S. Supreme Court was about to rule on whether life sentences without the possibility of parole for juveniles were unconstitutional. This ruling could further weaken the case against Alyssa. Faced with these obstacles, the prosecutors decided to offer a plea deal to Alyssa's defense team. They proposed amending the charges to second-degree murder, with a sentence ranging from 10 to 30 years or life imprisonment with the possibility of parole.
Her thinking.
Basically, the main reason for accepting the offer was to avoid the absolute certainty of life without parole. If there was
another option, then there would have been no reason to have accepted that offer.
Alyssa's defense team accepted the plea deal. In the end, Alyssa Bustamante was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole for the murder charge, plus an additional 30 years for armed criminal action. Under Missouri law, she will have to serve 35 years and 5 months before she is eligible for parole. Following Alyssa's conviction, Patty Price took further action. She filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Alyssa's grandparents and siblings, seeking to hold them accountable as well. The court awarded her $400,000 in a settlement, but Patty wasn't done. She also sued Alyssa herself, determined to ensure that the teenager could never profit from her crime. She didn't want any books, movies, or other media to bring Alyssa financial gain from the tragedy she had caused. Then, on July 25, 2017, a significant development occurred. Patricia Price agreed to settle another wrongful death lawsuit, this time requiring Alyssa to pay her more than $5 million. The settlement was part of a deal that also required Alyssa to notify Patricia if she ever received any compensation related to the case's publicity. The agreement ensured that Alyssa could owe Patricia $5 million plus interest at 9% per year until the debt was fully paid. Today, Alyssa Bustamante remains incarcerated at the Chillicothe Correctional Center in Chillicothe, Missouri. Her life behind bars is a far cry from the freedom she once had, and her future is uncertain. But no matter what happens in the courts or with the settlements, one heartbreaking fact remains. A little girl lost her life because of the uncontrollable, violent actions of a troubled teenager.